Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a terrifying game for many reasons, one of them being unable to discern imagination from reality. The protagonist of the game, Daniel, is having an unhealthy state of mind, and it can make you as the player equally terrified while immersed, having to stand in his shoes. Not everything is made up by Daniel's mind, and I reckon we are so far into the game that it is time to address and elaborate on threats that appear sentient and hostile. Alexander, the antagonist and Baron of the castle, is by Daniel characterized as being old and weak. His staff consists of rather bizarre servants, aiding in all sort of tasks ranging from castle maintenance and guard duty to dubious matters. These unconventional employers may have started out as regular human resources, as was the case with Wilhelm and his men, which at one point in time were granted wine poisoned with otherworldly properties. Daniel experienced an auditorial vision of the past detailing the event, and shortly after the expected intoxication, the men appeared to feel a sharp pain in their chest before their bodies would start to burst and become mutilated. It might appear as if this poison was a sort of essence from another world to fill a vessel with a sentient life form, and it is speculated by many that these spirits would mutilate the bodies in such a way as to turn them into a more suitable and receptive vessel. Or perhaps it was just an instinctive way for these spirits to kill off the original host before taking over? Next to nothing is known about the process, but regardless, it appears to be how the current servants, or gatherers as known by local villagers through folklore, became to be. The Baron likely performed experiments and surgery on these gatherers in order to stabilize them, particularly those encountered later on in the game, which can be seen having supporting metal structure sticking out of their arms and legs. They were also surgically fitted with a sharp weapon, where some ended up with a claw-like blades, and more fortified versions had their bodies burdened with a large, heavy sword. These experimental servants are very mysterious, and little is known about them for certain. They are merely briefly mentioned, even in the local village's folklore. They do seem to be lacking in intelligence, barely passing as living entities. Perhaps not even that. Are they actual zombies, the living dead? One thing is for certain. What they lack in intelligence, they certainly make up for with loyalty, and they obey the Baron's every command at the best of their efforts. Upon Daniel starting his new adventure past drinking his amnesia mixture, particularly traumatizing memories will slowly force themselves back into his mind. It is very likely that the servants up until that point in time were cloaked in order to hide their true appearance as to not cause a commotion, and once Daniel's relationship with the Baron visibly degraded, the servants likely dropped their cover, seeing as they were going to hunt him down anyway, thus scaring Daniel moments before he approached the rainy halls where he wrote his last note addressed to himself before consuming his amnesia mixture. This all-too-recent scare could explain why the grotesque gatherers' true appearance were never mentioned in any of his notes or diary entries. This happening very recent might also be why Daniel keeps hallucinating them from very early on in the game. The most common version of the servant is a pale, mummified-looking one, commonly referred to as a servant grunt. The skin on their bodies appear to have grown excessively thick and leathery. Their horrifying face looks bloated to the point of falling apart. The lower jaw is elongated and hanging straight down, and their bloated eyes have partially popped out of their skulls. Sharp objects stick out like an overgrown claw from their otherwise handicapped left arm, and artificial legs with boots seem to have been attached and sewn on them underneath their legs' thick skin. These rather primitive assistants are on the lookout for Daniel due to his current questionable loyalty to Alexander, although it is at this point unclear whether their instruction is to kill, to contain, or merely to pinpoint his exact location. Would you trust these feather-brained creatures to interpret and follow orders without error? As Agrippa mentioned in his note in the storage, that should not always be expected. No matter their intelligence quota, the servant grunts are both dreadfully horrifying and lethally dangerous, and they rightfully earn their infamous reputation in the village's local folklore. Their somewhat predictable behavior and instinct can be divided into three main aura and categories, each accompanied with an atmospheric soundtrack to announce that you are in grave danger and need to avoid confrontation at all costs. The dreadful beast has a leathery sound when moving, which I suspect either comes from its old boots or perhaps even its thick, leathery skin. It utters sounds similar to growling and wheezing. The Baron has assumed a role as a so-called prison warden, which could explain why there exists a more fortified type of staff. The servant brute is fiercer, stronger, and not least deadlier than the former version, and with this, the Baron has eliminated the risk of any inmates underestimating the dedicated prison guards, instilling deep fear in them, in contrast to the somewhat klutzy grunt type. The partially armored servant has a darker skin tone, as if previously boiled. The head is also split down the middle. Does this sound familiar to you? This might initially have been a human victim of the Guardian, and if we peek back into Daniel's journal, you will see what gave me that idea.
How has this escaped me? They're all dead. Limbs scattered, heads split down the middle, their skin flayed as if boiled. I feel like I'm falling into myself. What's happening?
The open head contains many misaligned teeth, and it is said that if you look closely, you can see an eye. Its skin is tearing up, as if muscles are swelling into a greater mass and weight. Its amputated left arm has been replaced by a metal prosthesis, which mostly consists of a large deadly sword with a sharp fang at the end, proving that it is less a maintenance tool and more a weapon to instill fear and savagely kill with. Small metal structures attached to the heavy limbs and sword seem to help keep them secured in place. The metal-influenced servant makes a crude and distinct grating sound during movement. As for its top floor compartment, it makes a very loud and deep wailing sound, as if made by a ferocious predator much larger in size. The distinct sound it utters sounds similar to what I imagine prisoners later on in the game would hear in their cells. You see, in order to instill as much fear as possible, the victims would hear tortured individuals through a pipe system leading into the cells. Perhaps the brute was fitted with something to purposely make its cry like this, as to have a similar effect throughout the dungeon. The water dweller, referred to as a Karunk, is a specimen that seems to originate from a different universe, possibly Alexander's home world. Even though it resides in water, it appears to be completely invisible to the naked eye, that of a human parrot at the very least. When excited, it will make a ruckus and loudly splash towards a point of interest. These tend to have a very limited reach outside of water. They are very hungry and can often be lured away by tossing flesh into the water, but do not be fooled into thinking you can tame one. As revealed in an earlier episode, concept art depicts them as follows. To me, this could look like a small dolphin-like creature. I imagine something like this could make very big splashes in shallow waters, as the end of its tail, its flukes, are horizontal, as opposed to their vertical alignment on fish. The water dweller appears to lack this, however. The wear part appears to be grotesquely torn off. The front half of the creature at least looks somewhat intact, though with a bit of more Jurassic characteristics. It has no visible eyes, so perhaps it merely goes by hearing? The gatherers sure are a mystery, but part of them were at least from this world. I do wonder, was Alexander able to perceive the water dwellers? He is not from this world after all, and a note later on in the game suggests that he has done research on them prior in time at the very least. The same note hints that the Baron in fact never brought the water dwellers with him, nor has the ability to summon nor keep them, as he is just now contemplating if one can be contained. I do not want to go too much into details of this note at the current time, that will be reserved for a later episode, but I will say that Johann Weyer, student and friend of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, appears to have mastered the arts of the mythical orbs without being filled with madness nor consumed by its guardian, and has now become what I can only imagine to be a deity of sorts. While not on friendly terms with the Baron, it is in their mutual interest to summon a water-dwelling Karnk to this world, something which only Weyer seems able to do. But do these creatures come from the Baron's homeworld, or do these water dwellers in fact dwell in a more hellish space in between worlds? It is not only the fully orb-infused Weyer who is able to transfer these creatures into this realm. As seen in the cellar archives, archive tunnels, and the cistern, it could appear as if the guardian of the orbs opens up a hellish gateway, sending through the aquatic predators. The first time Daniel encountered one, I assumed that the guardian tore down the structure to allow a Karnk-contained pool to flood the area. But now I am starting to believe that perhaps only water leaked out of the destruction, while a Karnk was conveniently slipped into the halls as a separate act. This opens up even more questions. Does the Guardian possess the same abilities as the mythical orbs? Or could he possibly even be the same thing, with the orbs acting as a physical body for the Guardian? Did Johann Weyer become part of this entity? Questions! All this time, I have been thinking of this creature as purely an otherworldly creature, but what if I say that this could very well be a creature from our own world? It looks similar enough to a dolphin in the concept art, I would say. We know much more about the entire universe than we do of our planet's ocean depths. Very little is in fact explored down there, even in this day and age. If there are orbs on land, who is to say that orbs cannot be in the ocean? Dolphins are also said to be among the absolute smartest animals on Earth. Is it possible that curious dolphins came into contact with submerged orbs, infuriating its guardian and being consumed by it? We know for a fact that the Guardian flays, boils, mutilates its victims, before sometimes them being ejected back into our realm, similarly to what is eventually observed in the Baghall's mildly traumatizing Fountain of Youth. Following this trail of thought, instead of the dolphins being outright killed, what if they were used as vessels instead, infused with foreign powers, mutilating their bodies, even granting them one of its own properties, being invisible to the naked eye? Similarly to the Baron employing grotesquely mutated servants, what if the Karnk are servants of the Guardian? I cannot help but feel they are in some way affiliated. Perhaps a minor detail, the Guardian and the water-dwelling Karnk share the same set of soundtrack. Is the music merely describing a collective invisible threat from beyond this realm, or do the Karnk and Guardian have more in common than we think? The Guardian of the Orbs, often called just the Guardian or Shadow, is certainly the most mysterious entity in this game. I would say it is something invisible to the naked eye, but that would not entirely give credit where credit is due, because it is as if the entity is not even residing in our part of the universe, if even our realm. When aroused, it roars from what feels like a different dimension, with only its roar tearing through a dimensional rift and being heard in our world. When on the quest to reclaim an orb, it seems to take on different sizes and forms, though still invisible and highly supernatural. It is as if it is a large dragon or dinosaur impatiently stomping around Castle Brennenburg, trying to get a better idea of Daniel's whereabouts. Often it will feel like a haunting spiritual presence that insanely tenses up the atmosphere and mind. At other times, it will appear as if it is sticking its large snout at the other end of a collapsed tunnel, while breathing and corresponding gusts of wind makes it through. At times, it comes off as a sentient predator. For instance, when Daniel is imprisoned late in the game and tries desperately to find a way out of his cell, the Guardian will observe for a bit, slowly closing in as if being fully aware that Daniel has nowhere to go, even taunting him with traumatizing memories before slowly flaying him alive. In contrast, should Daniel escape his cell and leave the area, the Guardian becomes enraged. It is as if it manifests physically as an invisible dinosaur, quickly giving chase and stomping after Daniel. Should it now grab hold of him, he will be killed in an instant. The Guardian not only appears to possess sentience and instinct, but also empathy, as may be shown in one of the game's endings. Amnesia: The Dark Descent would not be nearly as atmospheric if it was not for Mikko Tarmia's amazing soundtrack work, as he did an excellent job capturing the essence of both the various environments and threats alike. As follows are the various musical pieces that accompany the situation Daniel is currently in, giving a solid foundation for a highly immersive and utmost dreadful adventure. The common servant grunt, or a gatherer if you will, is on the constant lookout for Daniel, but it has little idea where in the castle he could be, and it has a lot of ground to cover in its search. This is likely one of the reasons why it tends to do a very lazy check before roaming to a different section of the castle. While one is in proximity of Daniel, its danger aura fills the atmosphere. This soundtrack is very twisted and sick, and at the same time it is fast-paced and feels unpredictable with an unsettling rhythm. To me, it describes clumsiness in both movement and mind, but at the same time, it feels as if confrontation will be deadly, and whatever this thing is, it is not to be meddled with. It gives the feeling of a persistent, lingering threat with little breathing room. An alarm-like sound can be heard twisting in and out, as if melting away one's sanity. It is for certain conveying the message of wanting to be as far away from this god-forsaken and unpredictable creature as absolutely possible. If the servant suspects that Daniel is in the near, which could be from a quick glimpse of Daniel, or sounds accidentally made by knocking things over or moving too hastily, the servant will often become much more determined and do a slightly more thorough inspection of the area, even breaking down more doors. The search aura in this state fills the atmosphere. This soundtrack emulates how one feels when you would hide from someone and accidentally knock something over to attract attention, and you subsequently might cover your mouth with your hand and hold your breath. This soundtrack sounds like you freezing up and trying to be as quiet and subtle as possible, and the few thoughts in between may come off as your heart pumping harder while skipping a beat, praying not to be spotted. The 3 heart-like thuds in this track are similar to what can be heard in the refinery, though at a slower pace. That very same area is also where Daniel has a risk of being spotted for the first time if he is not careful, so perhaps this is a clever foreshadowing of the searching servant deeper within. Should Daniel be spotted and be unfortunate enough for the Gatherer to realize what exactly it is gazing at, Daniel needs to run as fast as he can and hope to escape its wrath by fleeing this section of the castle, or at the very least being able to outrun it and finding a smart hiding spot. The attack aura fills the atmosphere. This soundtrack communicates that all trace of safe and discreet has been yanked away from beneath and around Daniel, and remaining passive is no longer an option. A dead husk of a body is aroused and staggering towards him, and it is as if he is approached by a highly energetic zombie. The music can also indicate that the servant is certain of Daniel's whereabouts despite having lost visual contact. Thus, the music may continue to play while the servant is agitated until it finally realizes that it has lost track. For example, tearing down a door and then struggling to realize where Daniel may have gone. The servant will usually revert to his curious search mode, where it tries to do a more thorough search and figuring out some obvious hiding spots, or its limited cognitive ability may cause it to forget about the whole ordeal, reverting it back to the mindless danger state, as it does a very limited check while roaming towards elsewhere. Whenever Daniel feels there is eye contact with the Gatherer, or when the Gatherer is agitated and chasing Daniel, a loud internal nightmarish siren will fire off within Daniel's mind to kick off his fear instinct for him to either freeze up in terror, or preferably make him jump up and flee from the spot like a prey animal, at least giving him a fighting chance at survival. This instinct sound, booming within his mind, is loud and will usually drown out the attack aura that the servant emits. This is commonly referred to as the terror meter. Should the grotesque figure catch up with and manage to successfully strike Daniel, its claw will leave multiple scratch lines on his body, and the imprint will form visually on screen for a brief moment. The first time Daniel gets a real good look at the grunt's silhouette is in the wine cellar. Illusion or not, the sudden sight is introduced with the subtle heartbeat thuds, and the panicky siren within the mind starts twisting in and out as his sanity melts away, giving your ears a short sample and introduction to this wild beast's dreadful soundtracks to come. Although the brute variant appears more determined and relentless than the grunt, they are both servants of the Baron and are likely possessed by the same kind of otherworldly spirit. Thus, they are similar when it comes to behavior while trying to investigate Daniel. The Baron has by this point enforced all staff to look for the potential troublemaker, and at the worst of moments, in comes the fortified brute, filling the atmosphere with its proximity aura. This soundtrack is intense from the very first moment. In contrast to the vile aura of the butler-like grunt, the strong brute's presence emits a strict soundtrack concentrated with pure terror and death. Metal grating has made its way into the track itself, and the 3 thuds from the grunt's intensified search aura is also being referenced, but this time from the start. Fitting, considering that the brute can come off as more thorough in its search. Furthermore, these thuds are no longer subtle, now slamming very loudly as if the heart tries to beat its way out of Daniel's chest. It could also be a reference to the brute possessing both more strength and a better weapon than the former servant. If this servant becomes suspicious, it will have a more thorough look around until its curiosity is content. In contrast to the grunt's searching aura, where the world stops up for a bit while you desperately hope for the creature to go away, this fortified servant's search aura fills the atmosphere with a different mood. This soundtrack breeds panic as the loud thuds speed up, much like Daniel's increase in heart rate. The music is building up to a climax as if cheering the brute on, and it feels like a matter of seconds before a deadly encounter with no escape. The feeling of despair and incrementing tension might be enough to make a sprint sooner rather than later, something which most definitely will lead to a chase. The aura of attack fills the atmosphere, and it feels like an eager executioner is on the way to perform their duty well in time, with little time to spare for playing cat and mouse. The aura of the brute is introduced into musical tracks on various occasions throughout the game, including the first time it was given a proper introduction in the morgue. As with this example, the soundtrack tells you to stop what you're doing immediately and look for a hiding spot. You can hear the brute's attack theme brought forward to indicate that a furious servant is looking for Daniel. Perhaps the approaching servant heard him fall to the ground after injecting the vaccine. If the roaming killing machine launches an attack without missing, the resulting wound on Daniel's body will show on screen for a second. Have you noticed the attention to detail, how a single long wound is vividly shown, as opposed to the claw-like wound from when a pale grunt attacks? One thing to note when being chased by a grotesque member of the Brennenburg staff is that an object may be hurled towards it in a desperate attempt to make it stumble or flinch, granting a chance to run past it or to cover some extra distance. As mentioned, the water-dwelling Karnk and the Guardian of the Orbs have a similar aura to each other, possibly hinting to the fact that Daniel cannot see any physical creature at the time and blames the current events on the overall paranormal. While I would not say the Guardian has one definite dormant aura, I would say that this soundtrack is the closest you would get to having just one. It is heard in the entrance hall once the Guardian draws nearer, and it feels like a fitting way to fill the atmosphere, making you question what this all is about while telling you this is not a safe place to stay, if it ever was. It gives a haunting feeling, as if you cannot really pinpoint what is wrong, but there is definitely something. Our aquatic beast has a very similar aura in its idle state, showing off its otherworldly affiliation. One of the differences is the addition of a high-pitched shrieking sound. This will in turn erupt into a get out of the waters now atmosphere should you decide to step into Karnk-infested waters. They are very hungry and they are not hesitating for a bite of flesh. While mostly associated with the Karnk, the track is called Guardian Attack in the game files. Something that sounds like a voice is haunting the soundtrack in a way as to suggest a powerful supernatural force on the loose, as if an angel of death is looking for Daniel. An even more intense attack soundtrack plays upon a larger, more fierce version of a Karnk being released in the archive panels. Due to its increased size, it has some reach out of water and has the power to push any obstacles aside. Although it is uncertain whether the soundtrack represents the larger current or the Guardian itself, as the Guardian loudly and angrily roars every few seconds, seemingly the main culprit in the situation. The eerie voice can be heard in this version as well, painting the atmosphere with a highly paranormal vibe. The same intensified music can be heard in the cistern. The current here is a regular-sized one, with the Guardian once again roaring relentlessly every few seconds, obviously enraged. But this is just me nitpicking at every little detail. Do you think I have a point in these, perhaps far-fetched thoughts? At the very least, now that we have taken a closer look at a few worries, if you will, that roam around the castle, it is time for Daniel to continue his journey to his past and hopefully his redemption. Let's just hope that Daniel's recently injected vaccine will be enough to reach the other end of the poisonous sewer system. But for now, I wish you a pleasant night. Thank you for watching.